What makes a bad term in office?
Well, crashing the economy, trust, that's pretty bad. But on a less obvious scale, I think on a really basic level, if things are actively, visibly worse than they were when you started, which sounds obvious, but, a lot of politics, it kind of stays the same. Take, let's say, Cameron's first term.
Okay.
So it wasn't, obviously, after his first term, Brexit happened, that's separate. But his first term, those first 5 years, with the coalition, it wasn't amazing, but it wasn't awful. Things, we had, it was a tough time because of austerity, but they were, they came into government knowing they'd have to deal with it because of the crash in 2008. And it wasn't bad. Or like Major, 92 to 97, what I was saying before, wasn't bad. It wasn't great. He didn't, it wasn't revolutionary. There weren't huge legislation coming in. Massive things weren't changing. But it didn't, nothing actively got worse. I think you can also say that a lot about Biden, actually. He wasn't the most we probably won't remember him very much in 100 years' time because he didn't change the country massively. He wasn't revolutionary, but he wasn't bad. He didn't do anything massively wrong. At least, I'm sure some people would disagree, but on a broad scale, I think a bad term in office, I think it's doing things that actively make things worse. I think it's also, a bad term in office is where it's a polling thing as well, isn't it? If you're, you look at how the, Sunak fared, look at how the Tories did in the polls on that term in office. I think if anything, it's harder to define a good term in office than it is to define a bad one.
Okay, what's a bad one?
Well, because like I said, a bad one is making things actively worse. But a good one, because how do you say that they made it better? Like you could say... I also think it depends where you're coming from, isn't it? Because Johnson, when he won in 2019, won on the back of I will get Brexit done. And he did, whether you agree with how he did or not. He did. He achieved a Brexit deal within a couple months. He won on like the 12th of December and we were out by the end of January.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you could say, well, yeah, he completed what was on his manifesto. So could you could say that's a good term in office. Obviously it's hard to judge Johnson. I don't like the guy, so I don't want to say that he deserves it to be fair, but he did have COVID. And so I don't, it's impossible to say what would he have done otherwise. There was also like the war in Ukraine, so it's impossible to say what would he have done otherwise because we don't know. I don't know where his term would have taken him. But yeah, you could say he had a good term because he did. There was one really big thing on his manifesto and he did it. I don't like saying that because I don't like what he did or what he stood for, but...
We never realistically like everybody 100% that's a figure in the past because we're never going to 100% agree because we're not them. Even they would disagree with what they've done in the past.
Yeah. I've very strong views on Johnson, I think. I think he has done a lot of damage to British politics as a institution. And I don't know if we'll ever get it back to what it was before he came into it. But, yeah, he did what he said he was going to do. He had same with Thatcher. Whether you agree with her or not, she came in with a manifesto of what she's going to do and she did it. Blair too. Whether you agree with what Blair did, he had a manifesto of the changes he was going to make and he did them. A lot of that comes down to whether they had a big majority. So maybe that's how you define a good term. It's a term where you had a big enough majority to do what you want it to do. You look at May, she didn't get anything done because she couldn't pass it. So maybe that's how you define a good term, is a big enough majority to succeed in your ambitions. Maybe that's how it's done.
So a realistic, reasonably sound bureaucratic framework, realistically.
Yeah. I also think external factors do have a role to play, There are always going to be again, in such a globalized world, so much of, you might have all these domestic policies that you want to do, and then, you get COVID, or you get Trump being re-elected. Like Starmer's, part of me feels bad for Starmer and his government, because, they're getting a lot of stick and they're getting a lot of people complaining. But, I guarantee you they weren't hoping Trump would win. They weren't banking on that. So they've now got to amend both the way that they're spending their time. How much time has Starmer spent doing international stuff that he probably wouldn't have been doing? He feels like he's barely in the country, because he has to do the foreign policy stuff. We had, they raised, like the tax on private schools, and everybody thought, that money can go into the NHS, for example. But it's not. It's had to go into defence, because we need to spend more in defence, because everybody's terrified that Trump's going to start a war. So I think, it's tricky, because whatever government you are, you come in with all these plans of, I'm going to achieve all these things, and then you get hit with a curveball, and the public are going to judge and say, well, you never did what you said you were going to do. And it's like, well, they tried. They didn't deliberately not do them, but, stuff gets in the way.
Do you think there is a danger of comparing politicians of the present, and even when they become politicians of the past, to politicians of the past? So an example I give you is just like, if you want to compare, really oddball example, if you want to compare, Blair, Brown and Mandelson to the great triumvirate of, the first triumvirate of Caesar, Crassus and Pompey. Really big jump, I know. But like, if you were to do that.
I mean, I think it's inevitable to make those comparisons, especially when, someone like you or I who've studied history and have studied politics and have an interest in both. I think it's inevitable. But I do think that, like I said before, things were so much, the issues they had to contend with were on such a small scale. Take Caesar and all that. They had, the world, in terms of, politically, the world was so much smaller. The issues that they had to deal with were a lot less complex. They weren't having to contend with something as complex as, for example, climate change, because it wasn't there yet. They didn't have technology and AI, for example. There's so...
Well, that level of technology,
the levels and levels and levels of issues that now exist. There's also a hell of a lot less people. There were less people in the world, so there was less people to care for, if that's a politician's job, is to care for people. There were less people to care for. So I think the most interesting way to compare them, actually, I think, is on a, the personalities of politics, I think, is a really interesting way to look at them, because, what kind of people make good leaders and make good politicians. I think that's probably the most both fair and interesting way to compare them, is to look at the sort of human side of politics, because, what is the mould of a good politician? What makes a strong leader? What, a leader with longevity? What kind of people go into it, but people search for leadership? I think that's a really interesting way to look at it.
If you really enjoyed that, don't forget to like and subscribe. And there's some more ones down here as well if you want to see any more. Go on, click it. It's worth it.